Welcome back, everyone. I'm very excited to get our business panel underway, and I hope you had a great lunch. So this morning we had very inspiring and thought-provoking insights from the policy perspective on trade, and now we shift to the business side and hear from firms how it is on the ground to navigate the complexity and kind of the tensions that evolve. So we heard about overlapping disruptions from geopolitical tensions, trade risks, sustainability pressures, and major shifts in supply chains. These forces create significant uncertainty for organizations of all sizes. Our panel brings the business perspective on how organizations respond in practice and how they are building resilience in this complex environment. What makes our panel especially valuable is the diverse mix of sectors and firm sizes represented, providing us with a broad and grounded view of how New Zealand businesses are experiencing global challenges. I'm very honored to introduce our panelists. Felicity Roxburgh is Executive Director of the New Zealand International Business Forum, brings deep expertise in international trade, foreign policy, and Indo-Pacific regional affairs. She plays a central role in shaping New Zealand's voice in the region. Justine Arroll is General Manager of Trade Strategy at Fonterra. Justine is a former New Zealand diplomat with experiences in the US, UK, and Wellington, and now leads Fonterra's global trade strategy and engagement. She offers a unique perspective on corporate responses to global shifts. And then last but not least, we have Nick Swallow, Strategic Advisory Lead at KPMG. Nick works closely with SMEs and mid-sized exporters, supporting strategy and market development. He previously served as NZTE's Trade Commissioner in the UK and Ireland during Brexit and as Regional Director in Latin America. Thank you so much, Felicity, Justine, and Nick, for joining us. And we will follow a similar structure than the previous sessions, where we hear reflections from our panelists, then I have some questions, and then we open the floor for discussions. But without further ado, please give a warm welcome to our panel. Thank you. Felicity, over to you.
Thank you very much. Tēnā tātou katoa, and I hope our panel doesn't cause any indigestion. I wanted to start by saying that I went to Mood of the Boardroom earlier this year, and this is a big thrill to go to Mood of the Boardroom, because when you're an official, as I was up until 4 months ago, it's quite hard to get into Mood of the Boardroom. It's a meeting of a lot of business leaders and a survey that the New Zealand Herald does of what's top of mind of business leaders in New Zealand. And geopolitical volatility ranked the #1 international concern at Mood of the Boardroom, alongside US-China political tension, US tariffs, international cyber threats, and rising nationalism. And in that same survey, 78% of CEOs reported that their boards were regularly assessing geopolitical vulnerabilities as part of their governance practices. So this is a strong indication that geopolitics is a significant and growing concern for business. But what do business leaders actually mean by geopolitical risk, and how are they responding to it? So it will come as no surprise to people in this room that businesses are concerned about geopolitical risk, but I'm not sure that there are many, apart from the lady to my right and a few other key trade gurus who work in the private sector, I'm not sure there are many that are thinking, wow, these framework deals really undermine the MFN provisions of the WTO. I'm not sure many New Zealand companies are thinking in those terms. They are thinking in terms of risk, geopolitical risk, but other types of risk as well: exposure to sanctions risk, supply chain disruption, the lingering effects of COVID, climate, the green revolution, AI, currency fluctuations. It's a lot. So what does all this risk sort of mean from a practical business perspective? What do we mean by this geopolitical volatility? So the first thing I think that's important is uncertainty. When we have uncertainty, firms are less likely to invest. No new equipment, no new hires. Anecdotally, we are hearing a lot of the sort of wait and see approach to behaviour in the US market. And we've had a period of low business confidence in New Zealand, and global uncertainty has certainly not helped that at all. Businesses are thinking about supply chain disruption. So what does this mean? We've heard a lot about supply chain disruption this morning. This is delays, freight prices, insurance prices, longer lead-in times. These are all now structural features of the business operating environment. So US-China tensions, but also the Russia-EU sanctions, the Middle East instability, shipping risks in the Red Sea and the South China Sea where you need higher levels of insurance. This is all adding costs and lead times and delays. Customs complexity, Deborah talked about this, filling in endless forms, non-tariff barriers, and the spillover risk. So spillover risk, okay, so I'm a timber exporter, I sell my timber to China, and China has been in an escalating trade war with the US, although we've hit the pause button, thankfully, for New Zealand for a little while, but suddenly the furniture that we indirectly make is considered a national security risk. So say what now to that? So none of this is welcome news to our exporters. But something a little bit unexpected has happened in some ways, is that conversely trade, including with the US, is actually held up quite well. So we've heard a lot of stuff this morning about how difficult the environment is, and that is 100% true, but why are we still trading well in that circumstance? And I should pause to say that I work with the International Business Forum, who are a group of large, primarily goods exporters. They have scale, they have optionality. So what I'm saying probably reflects more the big end of town, but we'll have a chance to talk about SMEs as well. So, the US tariffs, they have been catastrophic for some small SMEs who've gone out of business. They've been very challenging for particular sectors, including wine, seafood, very disruptive for other sectors, including meat and the kiwi fruit. It's on again, it's off again, what are we doing? But the feedback from many companies also is that part or all of the tariff has been able to be passed on to consumers. So 10% for many companies is within a kind of currency fluctuation rate that we already think about. The New Zealand dollar might go up and down 10% against the US dollar, so that's your 10% for some companies is already built into their strategy. 15%, particularly the commercial disadvantage or the competitive disadvantage against other trading nations like Chile for wine, some South American countries for beef, although that picture is evolving. Those two things were really painful. So why are we seeing trade hold up reasonably well? And I did see some statistics from Sense Partners that showed that there is a little bit of decrease in our export statistics to the US with a little degree of switching to China, but this is still very nascent statistics. We haven't yet seen the full impact of the US tariffs. We don't have good data due to the government shutdown. And there has been obviously some stockpiling ahead of the April tariffs, so that's still working its way through. I think it's fair to say, in New Zealand, we're very proud. We sell high quality premium products. These are desired by consumers. Beef, for example, there has been supply shocks on the US beef side. The commodity price has been high. The New Zealand dollar has been low. That has meant that our beef trade has held up. Just as an aside, perhaps this particular cycle cannot last forever, with commodity cycles being high and the dollar being low. So that's something for the future. Another thing, the tariff, we don't want tariffs. We don't like tariffs. But they are not the only thing that impacts our businesses. It's only one part of the puzzle. Other parts are pricing. How much is the consumer prepared to pay for our product? What are the distribution networks? Who are our in-market partners? How reliable are they? How good are they at selling our product? regulatory requirements, including around sustainability, and the things I've mentioned before, like distance, shipping costs, and the ease of banking. All of these matters along the tariff. However, if there's 15% to be had, we want that in the pockets of our farmers and our kiwi growers. We don't want it at the US customs, that's for sure. But to say that tariffs are only one part of the picture. So this is a very complex set of issues that our exporters have to consider, while also having an eye on the global picture. And, you know, even those of us who are doing it full time and who follow Deb on LinkedIn every half an hour to see what she's posted, it's hard to keep up, you know, it's hard to figure out what's happening. So how are businesses responding? I mean, the companies that I talk to, they're doing various degrees of scenario planning. Some of it's very sophisticated, some of it's, you know, more specific to their business. Many are leaning into their in-market partnerships, working with either, you know, advisory or trade association or commercial partners in the US. Optionality, this is something we can talk about on this panel. It's the new buzzword. We're not diversifying any more people because diversification has got kind of like a negative connotation to it. Optionality, you know, it's fluid, it's dynamic, it's agile, that's where we want to be. And looking more to government for advice and guidance. And I know from my short time in the Auckland office with MFAT, the appetite to hear from senior trade officials on corporate boards is increasing. So maybe I'll stop there because I think there's a lot to talk about and let my colleagues have a go. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Felicity. And we hear now from Justine.
Kia ora koutou, katoa. Thanks so much, Antje, for that introduction, and Jennifer and others for the opportunity to be here and speak on this panel. You know, many of you will be familiar with Fonterra, and it probably goes without saying that for us, trade is existential. So we are a large dairy exporter exporting to over 100 markets around the world, and we export 95% of everything that we produce. So for us, ensuring that we can get our product into market in the most efficient and effective way possible is a really important part of our business. And of course, you know, we've heard from many esteemed speakers this morning that what we're sort of seeing globally is a really unprecedented level of trade and geopolitical uncertainty, rising nationalism and protectionism, and anti-globalization sentiment. And for a trade-exposed company like ours that relies on access to overseas markets, that's really concerning. What we've seen really over the last, you know, sort of 10 or so years, I think, is just an increase in the frequency and intensity of these big global shocks. You know, when I think back, for most New Zealand agricultural exporters, we're actually very well accustomed over many decades of navigating highly complicated, highly protected markets. Agricultural trade has typically been some of the most protected and most distorted markets globally. But I think what we've seen over the last 10 years or so is just, as I said, that increase in intensity and frequency of events that have really significant and meaningful impact on global supply chains. You know, whether that's Brexit, Trump 1, the COVID-19 pandemic, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the war in Gaza and the flow-on implications for Red Sea shipping routes. Through to what we're seeing today with the US's America First trade and foreign policy. And we're also, as we've heard this morning, seeing an erosion of the WTO and the global rules-based trading system, which, you know, while far from perfect, has really underpinned a more stable and fairer, more predictable trading environment for New Zealand exporters and farmers. What I think this means is that these challenges are meaning that New Zealand businesses are more focused on how these events might impact on their supply chains and thinking through the types of steps they may need to take to manage and mitigate that kind of risk. You know, one of the things I'm always very mindful of, and I was saying to some of my fellow panellists earlier, is that Fonterra is a little bit unique in terms of our size and scale in the New Zealand economy and globally, and I'm very interested to sort of hear from Nick in terms of the sort of SME perspective, which I suspect will be a little bit different. But for us, we really see the size and scale of our business as an important mitigant in terms of being able to manage an increasingly more challenging trade environment. And I fully agree with Felicity in terms of the importance of optionality in managing trade and geopolitical risk. For us, what that looks like is not necessarily looking to diversify away from, particular markets because of, market access or trade challenges. Typically, we've invested a lot in building up, customer relationships, developing products that suit specific niches in a market, and it's very difficult to then walk away from those market-specific premiums and to divert product into other regions. So for us, what we see as being really important is maintaining that optionality, so that ability to pivot as market disruptions occur and to adjust our product mix or our market mix as we see necessary. And I think, with the increase in these types of disruptions, that is going to become something that New Zealand businesses are going to have to become more adept at. Another really key sort of facet for us is our strategic relationships and partnerships with both our customers globally, supply chain partners like Kotahi and Maersk, which are really important in terms of ensuring that we can get our product to market as reliably as we possibly can. And I think we'll probably delve into a little bit later in the panel some of the sort of internal processes that we've developed as a business to help us manage and mitigate these risks. I also did just want to pick up on something that Felicity, a point that Felicity made, which is, despite all of this uncertainty and the more sort of challenging international outlook, the reality is for a lot of New Zealand agricultural exporters is that actually, we have continued to perform very well despite all of this uncertainty. Continuing to see, strong commodity prices, strong demand for high quality, sustainably produced agricultural products for us, particularly in the dairy space. And, we're quite optimistic about, that continued demand, particularly as, from a dairy point of view, where we see supply constrained in some of the major dairy producing regions around the world. So I'll pause there, but looking forward to getting into some more of the specifics around how we're looking at some of these issues.
Thanks, Justine. It's so nice to have a sense of optimism here as well. So over to you, Nick.
Kia ora tātou, tēnā koutou katoa. My name's Nick. I'm, as mentioned, I work in a division of KPMG called Private Enterprise. So a lot of the businesses I'm working with are privately held. And as a consultant, there's nothing like a bit of disruption. It tends to drive things your way. And goodness knows there's been a lot of disruption this year. For context, I work with businesses who are dealing with this disruption. Entirely, the work that I'll be talking about today is in the US and exporting to the US. Businesses, to give you some kind of idea, is roughly 20 million to 200 million turnover per annum. So probably what we'd call medium-sized in New Zealand. Probably not really a representative sample because if they're coming to us, they probably have a little bit more money, perhaps, and therefore I'd be really curious to talk to businesses that aren't coming to us, but I can't talk about that clearly. But what I will say is not a lot of the discussions that we are having with businesses are around the multilateral rules-based system, WTO, APEC, any of that. The work is all about what can I do now, what can I do next, and then quite often we'll end up spending time of what does the future look like. And for many businesses, that will be sort of 3 to 5 year range if we get into those discussions. The now ends up dominating a lot of the conversations, and I can touch on some of those things. Now, the topic of this panel is around resilience. I do feel like resilience has replaced unprecedented recently, but really that's the ability to adapt. And I think that if there isn't a lot of external change, what I see is that the adaptation from businesses is on their own terms. And while we're talking about resilience, the adaptation is not on those businesses' terms to some extent. And the point here that I'm making is I think that New Zealand businesses, by and large, or many of the ones that I've been working with, are resilient, continue to be resilient, and have been resilient. However, they're just dealing with the resilience that is coming from this external change that's been put upon them. So I do feel that to be an exporter from New Zealand, let's face it, you can't get much further away. You need to be resilient. And so they're just responding to different changes. Now, I'm not dealing with trade teams quite often inside of these businesses. And what I do, the work that we do, I work more on that what next, I don't do so much of the now. That's really our transfer pricing, tax and customs team. I'm probably dangerous enough to know, I would say that I sort of speak fourth form tax, and that's about the level that I'm at. Definitely not conversational. And so it's great to have brilliant people within KPMG who can work through those issues. They are key technical topics for businesses. So what have we found, or what have I seen this year? I think Professor Draper talked about a number of things. Eat the tariff. That was one of the things he talked about. Yes, New Zealand businesses are eating the tariff. As disappointing as it may be, I think to an extent Trump is right on that other countries will pay the tariff. What we are finding is that's either fully the tariff, partially the tariff, probably more often than not partially the tariff, and then to a degree, in some very fortunate circumstances, businesses are able to pass on the full cost. What does that look like? So some businesses I work with dealing with directly with suppliers into, for example, red states. So they sell products that are going into Republican hands mostly. They haven't been able to pass on costs effectively. And so if they have the discussion around, well, these tariffs are costing us more, the response they get back is, I'm sorry, that's your cost. The president's told us that you're paying. When it comes to the big box retailers, so the Trader Joe's, the Walmarts of the world, they have trade teams, clearly. What we're seeing there has been up till now mostly a case of please don't talk to us about tariffs, that's your problem. But what I will say is we've noticed recently with some of the businesses we're working with, they're open to some of those conversations. And so price increases may be coming through for those businesses. I suspect because they're losing companies effectively and they want to maintain a certain level of supply. I think, and look, I probably don't have a representative sample, but from New Zealand companies, if you're selling a New Zealand product, you have a better chance because they want it on the shelf. So if it's Manuka honey, if it's wine or those types of things, better case to make with those businesses. What else do we see? There was not much concern around the structure of how you exported to the US prior to this. HS code, meh. Is it right or wrong? Not really too fussed. Probably nothing going to come back on me. Country of origin, don't need to worry about that whatsoever, particularly. I have a small MFN tariff. It's happy days. This has brought it all into clear focus for these businesses. And you've got to think there's a level of absorptive capacity within business, and you only focus on the things that are most commercially valuable to you. This has become commercially valuable. And so the founders that we're speaking to and their senior leadership teams now understand a lot of these topics. It's really interesting. I was reflecting with Justine. I was very heavily involved in supporting New Zealand businesses through Brexit. And there was a lot of head scratching during that. I'm finding now if I turn up to have these discussions with businesses and I start talking about Section 232 or even Section 301, I'll get onto why that's important, they know what that is. And again, I'm not probably having a representative sample, but they're up to speed because it's important to their business and it's relevant to what they're doing. To some extent, that talks about the tariff hopping and then the investment in market. I'm not seeing a lot. Now, I talked about the now, next, and future, a little bit on the next, and to some extent in the future, but there's a definite wait and see approach in business, which I think is a sensible response. Some businesses can configure their supply chains to an extent to be able to either shift HS codes, looking at substantial transformation and those types of things, or shifting some level of manufacturing into the US. Now, what's becoming really difficult for business is rules of origin and country of origin. The US system through Customs and Border Patrol, I know if I got that right, anyhow, is extremely difficult to navigate simply because it's on to some degree, a case-by-case basis. So what we're finding is that understanding that substantial transformation becomes critically important, and documenting that for businesses is extremely valuable to them. Sorry, I just have to keep up with my notes. It's not all doom and gloom, too, I would say that. For many businesses, or some businesses from New Zealand, this is difficult. If you export 85% of your product to the US, there's no doubt that this is a challenge. And what's been a double challenge, I think this has been mentioned, is the differential between particularly Australia or other similar trading partners and New Zealand of that 5%. That does make it difficult. But probably more difficult is there's been seen by many of the businesses we're working with is reduced consumer spending in the US, particularly in areas that aren't seen as staples. So that has been a challenge. And in response, what we're seeing is a lot of New Zealand businesses reducing their complexity in market. So reducing the number of SKUs, focusing on areas where it might be, they might have a higher value or higher margin. Now, it's tempting to kind of think that we just make stuff in New Zealand and ship it to the US. That's absolutely not the case of the businesses that we're dealing with. Oh, sorry, actually, I'll just go back one point. In some instances, this can be a competitive advantage, this change in situation in the US. And so some businesses within New Zealand are leaning into that and going, we have an opportunity to capture market share here, because companies that who are our competitors have supply chains that have a different tariff makeup. They might be more heavily reliant on on China. And so for some businesses, this can actually be a turning point or a moment in time where they can take advantage of the situation. But yes, going back to China production, and even complex supply chains through Asia in terms of some of the businesses we're working with, it becomes very difficult. There is a rule, I won't go into it too much, first sale for export, which is a very helpful tool and pretty much specific to the US, which allows you to lower your customs value based on the first sale, regardless of if that sale is outside of the US. And what we're seeing there is that is achievable for many New Zealand businesses in a way of lowering the value of your product at the border, so reducing the tariff you need to pay. However, it does require an extraordinary amount of paperwork and understanding to get that, to be able to justify that, or if you're investigated, be able to show what you've done. And so what we're seeing is companies needing to reduce some of the complexity in their supply chains to be able to meet that first sale for export ruling. But it's achievable. And so I suppose that goes back to that resilience point. This is an external change that's been forced upon businesses. They are adapting. New Zealand businesses are adapting, just as they've adapted to other shocks in the past. And I think, if anything, what this has brought to the fore for those businesses is the need to deeply understand many of these trade issues and understand what the impact is on their business and how they'll deal with those now. But also, having those things in place now allows them to deal with future shocks in this trade space as well. So I'll leave it there and then open for questions.
Thank you so much, Nick. I believe we heard a lot about how businesses navigate uncertainty, and optionality was mentioned by Justine and also this morning. If you have optionality, there is an underlying tension between whether you have a strategic focus for markets or whether you diversify. And my question would be mainly for Justine and Nick, is in a way, what advantages and risks do you see whether you pick a strategic focus or you have a more diverse portfolio?
Yeah, look, it's a great question, and I think one that is really sort of important for New Zealand as a New Zealand Inc. to be thinking through quite carefully. And look, it will, at a business level, it will really depend from business to business and across different sectors. I mean, from a Fonterra perspective, we feel quite confident that we've got a sort of a well-diversified portfolio. As I said, we operate across 100 markets. China is certainly our largest market, accounting for about 30% of our portfolio. The US is second, and then there's sort of quite a long tail of still very important and valuable markets, but which are relatively lower in value. As I said, I think the size and scale of a company like Fonterra, and we see it sort of in other sectors with the likes of Zespri, these are companies that have been established to provide that scale on the global stage, which I think is really important for a small country at the bottom of the world. And for us, we are, very focused on maximising the revenues and the highest returning markets to ensure that we're providing the highest returns back to our farmer shareholders. That's the kind of the underlying ethos of a cooperative, which is what Fonterra is. And so while trade and geopolitical uncertainty is certainly a consideration when we're thinking about that footprint across different markets, diverting product proactively to lower returning markets doesn't necessarily provide you with a robust insurance policy, and obviously has a negative impact in terms of revenue. So what our approach is really focused on is ensuring that we've got a pretty well-balanced portfolio, and we undertake regular reviews of what our footprint looks like across the globe, and then undertaking activity around how we manage and mitigate trade and geopolitical risk. And certainly what we've sort of, I think our approach to that has really evolved as a business, certainly over the last 5 or 6 years, and we've deliberately taken a much more structured approach to our management and mitigation of geopolitical risks, reflecting just the more uncertain trading environment that we're operating in. So as a business, we have 18 enterprise risks that are on the advice of management, approved by the board, and one of those risks is geopolitical and trade risk. And we report quarterly to the board on key developments. We undertake horizon scanning and advise on upcoming risks or opportunities for the business that the board needs to be considering, and then thinking through how we manage and mitigate those individual risks. So the US, I know we've talked about it a lot today, and it's obviously very, very topical, but that was a particular focus for us. Some risks you don't get a lot of warning about. For example, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that obviously caught a lot of people off guard, certainly the kind of the extent of it, and how quickly that came about. And we closed our business and exited the Russian market very, very quickly after that. So very limited ability to proactively think about how we would manage that risk. But for the US, for example, there were clear signals throughout the campaign last year that should Donald Trump become the next president of the United States, that they would likely adopt a more protectionist trade policy, and tariffs would certainly feature as part of that. So we undertook quite a structured approach and undertook scenario planning to think through, okay, so if you've got a red team scenario or a blue team scenario, what would the implications be on key policy issues for Fonterra? Post the election, clearly, Donald Trump is going to be the next president, tariffs are going to feature, so what does a 5, 10, 15, 20% tariff look like on our product going into the US, and what would we do if that came about? And it's not about predicting the future, and we certainly don't get it right by no means, but what it does help is make sure that there's really cross-functional input into developing the scenarios and thinking through our potential responses. So it's not just sitting with the trade strategy team at Fonterra. We have input from our colleagues in our legal team, our regulatory team, our customs team, sales teams. So when these events do occur, or some variety or variation of them do occur, as a business, you've just got a lot more preparation under your belt in terms of moving and adapting more quickly.
Thank you.
Yeah, so from that medium business size perspective, optionality would be wonderful, but optionality is an opportunity cost. And so just to give you some kind of, so the US is a market for New Zealand. Yes, it's dominated by primary produce, but it's not as dominated by primary products as other markets. So it's about 60%, so roughly 40% primary products, produce. Similar to kind of Australia, very different to China, where I think we're sort of about 85%. So this is a significant high-end market for New Zealand and for a lot of New Zealand businesses. They are not wanting that to disappear. They're thinking a little bit more long-term. So in some businesses, we're talking about net profit going down to almost zero in some of these markets because they're eating the tariff to a degree. And that's a holding position. So I'll reduce costs in other areas. I'll limit the amount of stock. But long term, I still see that the US is going to be critical, and I don't want to lose this. Yes, then you can start thinking about optionality. But if you have that optionality and you're trading with other markets. Now, many of the businesses I'm working with, also to give you a range, probably 20% to the US, exporting to the US, through to about 85% exporting to the US. So if you're at that higher end, you don't have many options. And so therefore this becomes quite a difficult situation for you. If you're at that 20% end, yes, you have more, but the chances are you've probably invested quite a bit into developing those other markets. You probably tap them out as far as you can potentially, but it just becomes a little bit more difficult. New Zealand businesses offshore, if they're investing into the US, are probably looking at, that might have been a 20-year development of relationships, working with suppliers right through to end consumers, to kind of walk away from that to a degree or to de-emphasize that becomes quite challenging. And you know, there's almost that kind of sunk cost already that you want to keep going. So what we're seeing is businesses just wanting to either, yes, I talked about some who see it as a competitive advantage, that's great for them, but others who are kind of going, actually, can I just ride this out to a degree and hope for change for the better that will come through? Or I'll start to see other opportunities inside the market and work that through. But there are none that we have, no businesses that I have worked with, none of the clients have kind of walked away. And you can imagine if you fictitiously make polo sticks, there's not a lot of markets for polo sticks globally. And the US might have the largest polo market share globally. I mean, that's significant, and you want to be seen in those markets and you want it to be out there. So those are the kinds of things that decisions businesses are grappling with.
Thank you so much. Another question I have for Felicity, and we heard a lot about, in a way, policy thinking, how they could support business, but from your experience, what are actually actions that do help, that business want to see?
Yeah, thank you. This is a good and important question. I mean, the government has a 5-pillar strategy, which every trade official in this room should be familiar with, and I do think, you know, that's a broadly well-received and well-placed strategy. Pillar number 1 is negotiate more FTAs. I mean, certainly the India FTA is of huge interest to our members. That's about the optionality, but that's also future-proofing for the next big markets. There is a question about whether we're reaching peak FTAs. So if strategy number 1 is keep negotiating FTAs, the 2 major markets that are left for New Zealand are India, you know, huge amount of investment and energy going in there, and the US. And we've talked a lot about why the time might not be right for that as well. After that, it's harder to see what would be the new markets. I mean, South Asia, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, they're important for dairy, as Justine has explained to me. North Africa, Algeria, I mean, it's messy, it's difficult, but there's opportunities there. Egypt, maybe a few bits of South America. But essentially, we're kind of reaching peak FTAs. So pillar 1, good, particularly India. I think it's important to remember that this also, the overlapping regional architecture, it creates a lot of complexity. So do I sell my good under the CPTPP or under ASEP or under the bilateral FTA? So the more that the government can come up with good practical tools like the tariff finder, is there more we can do with the tariff finder? Can we have a chat bot where you like say, hello chat bot, I'm selling, you know, a sausage. Where shall I sell it, under which HS code, into which market, and which part of which, you know, organizer, which regional architecture tariff code should I use? So the opportunities are there, but do we have the tools so that we can make the most of it? Non-tariff barriers. When I first started in this job, I did a little survey of all the members, and I said, what do you care about? Do you care about open plurilaterals? Do you care about the US economy? And the ones that ranked the most highly were US tariffs, the India FTA, the Chinese economic situation, and NTBs. So that for our companies is at the top level with those really key commercial opportunities. And then I made this point earlier, but I think you cannot underestimate the appetite for good quality, actionable intelligence. People read the Financial Times, but you can't find out in the Financial Times, what does this mean for my company? So bespoke help, individual help, webinars, all of that's good stuff. I think just really leaning into that because the interpretation or translation piece that the government can do, that businesses cannot so easily do for themselves.
Thank you so much. A final question from me for all of you is, we talked about managing uncertainty, and one strategy was really that optionality. But what are other strategies that companies can use to keep resilient, right?
So I've asked this question of a lot of sort of risk management professionals, in an increasingly uncertain world, how do we as a business try to insert more certainty? And the consistent feedback and advice that we get is just around the importance of scenario planning. And this is something that we've really adopted into our risk management processes particularly around trade and geopolitical risk. As I said, it's not about predicting the future, and it's not about investing endless resources in, undertaking these really kind of complex development of very complicated scenarios. But it's really just about how you get your business thinking, beyond the sort of immediate future into more of a long-term, what are some of the big potential, shocks that could occur, changes in our operating environment, and then working backwards, what do we need to be thinking about as a business to ensure that we are best placed to sort of manage and mitigate that risk.
Look, I'd add to that, trade is so hot right now, kind of. There's the sense that I get inside the business community from the perspective that there's not something you really needed to consider too much previously, but now it's become very important. And where have seen an example of where that's particularly effective is I was working with one client who is selling X works, so out of their warehouse effectively in New Zealand. And they had spent the time to understand what was changed. Sorry, this is just one of their clients. They also sold through a sub in the US and in various places. But one client was purchasing this way because that's the way they wanted it done. They spent the time to really understand their trade situation and realise that perhaps some of their customers who were purchasing X works from them didn't understand as much as they then understood. And then went to those customers and said, do you realise that if you change your trade situation, you'll have this level of savings for their customers, right? So taking it beyond just what's my situation and looking at what can I do to value add. So that was really important for them from that trade perspective and trade understanding. Through to, yes, scenario planning as well. To some extent, what we've been doing with clients is looking at financial modelling of different situations. So how might you approach your customers in the US and looking at are there potentially discounts that can be provided for bulk ordering or those types of things, and or if we switch to other markets, what might that look like from a bottom line perspective? So it's probably less a case of kind of doing a deep risk analysis and looking at what the scenarios might look like, but more from a financial perspective, how can we arrange the chairs so that we get the best result to a degree?
And I would add more at the strategic level. I mean, MFAT's got the big shifts, but I think there's also a shift from trust to proof. you know, New Zealand's gone very far on our reputation for high quality, clean products, good animal welfare standards, but in the future we're going to need to make sure we've got the traceability architecture to show and demonstrate that value add to our consumers in market, because in an uncertain world we're probably going to have to charge more for our products, so we're going to want to be able to scan a barcode and see the happy sheep and see the, you know, very good packing warehouse. So I think investing in the digital side, paperless trade is part of that as well, in the data and the traceability so that we can ask for those premium prices.
Can I just add, sorry, one more thing, which just struck me as others were speaking, and I'm sort of conscious that this audience is made up of a large number of New Zealand government representatives and representatives from other governments around the region, and I think, you know, one of the other really important sort of risk mitigants we have available to us to sort of help us all navigate this very uncertain world is just the importance of sort of coalition building, and leveraging from a New Zealand perspective the sort of NZ Inc. Community. So whether that's, you know, the insights and intelligence that we can get from, you know, the MFAT and MPI network, to working with like-minded business associations and industry groups and government officials around telling the story of New Zealand and what we contribute. You know, one of the really important you know, elements of advocacy in the US context has been helping US stakeholders understand the nature of New Zealand's contribution to the US economy. So for us, you know, we're supplying high quality dairy ingredients which go to US food and beverage manufacturers, infant formula producers, medical nutrition companies. You know, these are businesses that where we're contributing to US jobs, US revenue, and helping them deliver to their customers and consumers. So we can't do it on our own. We really need to you know, do as much as we can working together.
Thank you so much. We now open the floor for questions. Anybody? Was a lot of information, and I know it's a different perspective. Yes, please. Stephanie.
Stephanie Honey. Thanks so much. What an interesting panel. Just picking up on something that you said, Felicity or Justine, I can't remember, Justine, about coalition building. You know, we heard in the first two panels of the day about coalitions among countries, economies, you know, groups. Do you think there's likely to be any coalition building among businesses? I mean, this has been something, it's been very interesting to watch, the sort of dipping the toe in the water of US businesses trying to develop a sort of a unified response to the new US trade policy. In ABAC, certainly we've talked a bit about it, but I mean, do you see a lot of that in your networks, and Felicity likewise among your members, or Nick from your customers? Thanks.
Thanks for the question, Steph. I think the short answer is yes. You know, I've been really kind of heartened, I think, to see how much the New Zealand business community, together with the New Zealand government departments, has sort of come together as we all try to understand kind of and respond to particularly developments coming out of the US. And we see our, you know, memberships of organisations like the NZIBF, for us the Dairy Companies Association, as being really important sort of amplifier, insight gathering, and kind of give us that scale to try and, you know, influence and advocate for our interests globally. And we see it as well in the US. You know, we are actually, you know, despite what you might expect, we've actually been working very closely with the US dairy industry throughout the, you know, for a very long time, but including over the last year or so, to do what we can to try and influence them positively. Particularly, we've got manufacturing in the US, so we're part of some of the US processing associations. So again, trying to sort of use our memberships of those organisations to try and help influence sort of policy decisions and consideration of issues to, you know, in a positive direction. And I think, you're obviously very involved in the likes of ABAC, but those sort of international, business groups, I think, at a time when, international diplomacy is only more, is only more challenging, those types of organisations that run in parallel are even more important.
Yeah, I would agree, and I think it's actually an opportunity to accelerate collaboration between business and government. I think that's one of the sort of bright silver linings of this.
Yeah, look, that from a coalition perspective from the private sector, in many ways I think New Zealand's a really strange economy from a trade perspective, and I haven't done these types of roles in other countries, or for other countries rather. But like, if I take my fictitious example of polo sticks, what you'd find is 3 out of the 4 main suppliers of polo sticks in the world came from New Zealand. Like, that's the kind of thing that I always come across in the New Zealand economy, that you have these small niches, but then within that niche you have, more than one New Zealand company filling it, and it's kind of like, how did that happen? And usually there's a good story. What I tend to see is those companies can be, that they might be somewhat acrimonious onshore, but offshore they generally tend to work quite well together. And what I think what I saw in the early days of the tariffs coming in was many New Zealand businesses creating their own kind of support networks around, the fashion industry, or probably not the polo stick industry, but other ones in there. And so that I think from that perspective, those kind of private sector coalitions are really important, because you get good sharing of information, and that does exist to some extent outside of a government environment. But I think there's a role to play also for government in that, in terms of how it supports those to function. Because in many ways, those are the things that will be most listened to by those businesses.
Thank you. We have time for one more question, I believe. Please.
Thanks very much, all. So over the weekend, the US decided to reprieve some tariffs on food products, which benefits New Zealand in beef and kiwi fruit, I think, particularly. Just wondering, in the context of sort of businesses craving certainty, is there a way in which that reprieve is kind of annoying for New Zealand businesses that thought they had some sort of certainty of working towards a 15% tariff as sort of model of operating, a new normal? Is there a way in which it's sort of more annoying than it is beneficial? Or I guess stepping back, is this good to see the US is actually responding to some of the inflationary pressures that are hitting their consumers, and are sort of deciding, noticing that tariffs are actually having impacts on the US?
Yeah, I think it's both good news and bad news, isn't it? It's good news in the sense that, of course, if we go back to zero tariff or low tariffs or MFN tariffs, that's positive, because in the meat industry they're saying maybe $300 million has been lost to the tariff so far this year. So again, $300 million, we prefer that in the pockets of our farmers. But the unpredictability, on the one hand, the fact that there is some response to what's happening domestically gives us maybe a little indicator of where President Trump's head might be in the future. One hesitates to make any predictions, that there is going to be potentially some reaction if all economists on the planet are right and the tariffs are inflationary, then there will be some reaction to that. But on the other side, as has pointed out in the panel this morning, we don't know what's going to fill that void. It could be worse. 232, 301, many of them have got much higher tariff rates than 15%. So, make hay while the sun shines and buckle up, people, is what I would say.
Look, so obviously dairy wasn't included in the products that were granted tariff relief, but certainly from our perspective, I think my view is that it's a very positive development, because I think it does indirectly reflect a recognition that actually, imports are complementary, and that the additional tariffs are contributing to domestic inflation. So our hope is that further products, particularly dairy, will be maybe included in the future. So, I think business always craves certainty. That's a truism that holds, but lower tariffs are always better than higher tariffs.
nothing for me.
We do have 2 more minutes. I just got that, so please.
Hi, hi, I'm Colin Rice. I'm involved with across a number of businesses, about 5 or 6, and probably 4 of which are exporting to the US. So I was really just providing a bit of a commentary as well as responding to that question around collaboration. The response which I've seen from business has been threefold. One is to look at transfer pricing and really kind of focus on that more than has been historically the case. With a 15% tariff, I think there was a comment earlier that about 10% a lot of businesses viewed as being, it's in the FX range that the currency can move in the year. At 15, we felt that we had to respond. We've passed on those tariff increases. It's not as big as increase as 15 because it's the cost into the country. So the price going on to the consumer is in one case half of that, in one case slightly less than half. And that's been accepted in market. So that is a response which we've seen being kind of successfully deployed. In terms of optionality, that's definitely something which businesses are looking at. So for the ones I'm involved in, particularly looking at UAE and also interested in the developments in India, which brings the collaboration point. And on collaboration, one of the classic examples of collaboration for New Zealand businesses was PCNZ, going into China, and that was a genuine collaboration between New Zealand businesses being able to access that market and share infrastructure into that market. I think with the Indian potential free trade agreement, there's a real opportunity to mirror that approach into the Indian market. It is not an easy place to do business, and I think that would be a real kind of practical opportunity to deploy something which we've seen working previously in another challenging market, which has been a massive success in terms of our trading with China. So, sorry, that's not really a question, but just wanted to provide a different perspective.
Would you like to reply? No. I believe our time is unfortunately up, but maybe there's a quick question.
I know that some requirements regarding standards, certifications, conformity assessment, environmental or maybe organic, for instance. So I saw that the trust actually we should put on it, and how New Zealand or New Zealand businesses or New Zealand consumers actually consider that. Because, for instance, you have FTA with ASEAN, and how do you consider, like in those agreements or those blocks we call MRA in WTO, how do you actually trust least developed country, maybe like us, for instance? And we know that you have really good development in terms of products in New Zealand or in Australia, but how do you deal with those countries' products that actually want to import to New Zealand or Australia or other countries? What I mean is related to certification standards and conformity assessment, because this is kind of another layer of the tariffs. And as you know that, for instance, if I try to export product to New Zealand, I need fair trade certification, organic certification. This is something that adding to the cost of the export, actually.
So if I understand the question correctly, it's sort of more around the kind of the regulatory requirements for exporting into key markets through under mutual recognition agreements or the likes, and how that layer of complexity is in addition to the
how do you trust us? I mean, some
coming the other way. Is it importing into New Zealand?
Yeah, how do you trust us? For instance, I just want I'm sorry, I know the time, but I just want to make an example. Sometimes you think that, oh, this country, we don't trust you because you do some imitation or some adding something there. But based on this FTA, then you have conformity assessment that actually set up. How do you trust how it is benefit the LDCs?
I'm wondering, I know there's a panel later today with representatives from some of the New Zealand government departments, and that sounds like a great question for them. I'm thinking Bill Jolly from MPI.
Nice.
Thank you so much. I think it gives time to think about the question. I want to thank the audience for the great questions, and of course our panel, Justine, Felicity, and Nick. Please join me to thank them for that inspirational session.